5 in the morning. The USS Abraham Lincoln was moving through the dark, heavy waters of the Philippine Sea. Her massive hull displacing 100,000 tons of salt water while her crew of 5,000 sailors worked or slept in the artificial, humming light of the lower decks. Somewhere 2,000 kilometers to the west, a weapon was already in flight that the carrier's trillion-dollar nervous system could not yet perceive. A silent killer riding on a cushion of air and fire. The ocean air was thick with the scent of ozone and jet fuel, the surface of the sea as flat and black as polished obsidian, under an overcast sky that seemed to press down on the mast of the ship. This was the 20th day of a conflict that no one had wanted, but everyone had expected. A collision of two empires that had finally run out of room to maneuver. In the crowded waters of the Western Pacific, the war had not begun with a grand declaration or a sudden storm of fire, but with a series of small, irreversible frictions that eventually caught flame and consumed the peace of the world. For years, the tension had built over the ownership of the deep-sea ridges and the sovereignty of the island chains until a single accidental collision between two destroyers near the Paracel Islands turned a diplomatic crisis into a shooting war. Now, the United States Navy found itself operating in an environment where the old certainties of naval supremacy were being stripped away, layer by layer, by a new generation of high-speed violence. The Abraham Lincoln was the center of a carrier strike group that represented the ultimate expression of American power. Yet her officers knew that they were no longer operating in an era where steel and numbers alone could guarantee survival. High above the atmosphere, moving at more than 10 times the speed of sound, the DF-17 Hypersonic glide vehicle was screaming through the thin air, its nose cone glowing a dull, lethal red from the friction of its passage. Unlike the ballistic missiles of the previous century, which followed a predictable and trackable arc through space, this weapon was maneuvering like a ghost, skimming the edge of the atmosphere and shifting its course with calculated precision. It was encased in a sheath of superheated plasma, a veil of ionized gas that absorbed or scattered radar waves, making the missile nearly invisible to the very sensors designed to detect it. The Aegis combat system, the most sophisticated air defense network ever built by human hands, was searching the skies with its AN/SPY-6 radar arrays, but it was looking for targets that obeyed the traditional laws of physics. The technical failure was not a matter of incompetence, but a fundamental gap between the speed of the software and the speed of the threat, as the missile moved faster than the system could process a reliable track. In the combat information center of the Lincoln, the screens showed a clear horizon, yet the physics of the engagement were already dictated by a weapon that had rendered the concept of a defensive perimeter obsolete. The sailors in the darkened room, illuminated by the blue and amber glow of their consoles, monitored the empty sky with a professional confidence that was about to be shattered by a reality they could not yet imagine. There is a specific kind of hubris that comes with 70 years of undisputed command of the seas, a belief that the carrier is not just a ship, but a sanctuary that no enemy would ever truly dare to violate. This was the tragedy of the Iron Horizon, the moment when the mechanical superiority of the past met the kinetic innovations of the future in a collision that would rewrite the history of warfare. The geopolitical context that had sustained the carrier as the primary instrument of global order was dissolving in the heat of a plasma-wrapped projectile that did not care about the size of the target or the weight of its history. Both superpowers had spent decades preparing for this exact morning, one building a shield of unprecedented complexity, and the other building a spear designed specifically to shatter it, and the result was now only minutes away. The silence on the bridge of the Abraham Lincoln was absolute, save for the quiet murmurs of the watch officers and the distant, rhythmic throb of the nuclear engines far below the waterline. If the ship was a city of steel, it was a city built on the assumption that its walls were high, enough to keep out any storm, forgetting that every wall eventually meets a force it cannot withstand. The soldiers on both sides were merely the instruments of a larger, colder logic, Individuals caught in the gears of a machine that had been set in motion by decisions made in distant capitals long before the first shot was fired. Despair was not yet present on the ship, but it was coming, moving across the water at 5 kilometers per second. A dark realization that would forever change the way humanity looked at the sea. The overcast sky remained indifferent, a gray ceiling over a theater of war where the actors were about to discover that their stage was much more fragile than they had ever been led to believe. 6:15 in the morning. Inside the Combat Information Center of the USS Abraham Lincoln, the air was chilled to precisely 68 degrees and carried the sharp, sterile scent of ionized dust and high-voltage electronics. The room was a windowless cavern of blue and amber light, where the low hum of cooling fans provided a constant, rhythmic backdrop to the quiet murmurs of the watch officers. On the primary tactical displays, the world was rendered in clean, geometric lines, a digital abstraction of the Philippine Sea, where every friendly ship was a steady green icon, and every potential threat was a scrutinized yellow flicker. For 20 years, the Aegis combat system had been the undisputed master of this digital realm, a complex web of processors and sensors that could track 1,000 targets while simultaneously guiding 100 missiles to their kills. However, on this morning, the ghost in the machine had begun to manifest as a series of intermittent, flickering returns on the ANSPY-6 radar arrays. The radar operators, young men and women trained to trust the machine more than their own eyes, watched as the system struggled to fuse the incoming data into a coherent track. A sensor return would appear at an altitude of 100,000 feet, moving at 5 kilometers per second, only to vanish into the background noise of the atmosphere before the computers could assign it a target number. It was as if the sky itself was glitching, producing a phantom that existed outside the logic of the software, a presence that the most advanced combat system in the world was trying to ignore because it did not fit the established parameters of a threat. The tactical action officer stood behind the consoles, his eyes narrowed as he watched the flickering yellow symbol that the system refused to categorize as a hostile track. There is a specific kind of psychological paralysis that occurs when a professional is confronted with a failure of the tools they have spent a lifetime mastering, a moment of hesitation where the mind tries to force the reality into a familiar box. He knew, intellectually, that the People's Liberation Army had spent decades developing a weapon designed to exploit the limitations of American radar, a glide vehicle that would wrap itself in a sheath of superheated plasma. This plasma was not just a byproduct of speed. It was a physical barrier that absorbed the radar pulses of the strike group, turning a 10-ton missile into something no larger or more distinct than a flock of birds, or a pocket of atmospheric turbulence. The silence in the Combat Information Center grew heavier, the rhythmic clicking of keyboards sounding like the countdown of a clock that no one could see. To the west, the escorting destroyer DDG-51 and the cruiser CG-73 were reporting similar anomalies, their own computers struggling to make sense of the high-altitude clutter. The data link between the ships, usually a seamless flow of tactical information, was becoming fragmented as the systems attempted to reconcile conflicting reports of a target that was simultaneously everywhere and nowhere. The crew began to feel a slow, cold current of dread moving through the compartment, a realization that the shield they had relied upon for their entire careers was beginning to fray at the edges. This was the intersection of human limitation and technological hubris, where the speed of modern warfare had finally outpaced the ability of the human brain to intervene. The officers in the room were not lacking in courage or skill, but they were prisoners of a system that required a clean, trackable target before it would allow them to pull the trigger. They were waiting for the machine to tell them what was real, even as the real world was closing in on them at 5 times the speed of sound. The environment of the room, once a source of comfort and control, now felt like a tomb of flickering lights and useless data. a place where the collective knowledge of the military was being rendered obsolete in real time. The philosophy of the combat system was built on the idea of total awareness, a belief that if you could see everything, you could kill everything. But the long-range missile was a weapon designed to prove that seeing is not the same as perceiving, and that awareness is a fragile thing when the enemy moves through the gaps in your vision. The tactical action officer finally reached for the internal communications handset, his voice steady despite the sweat beginning to bead on his forehead, and called the bridge to report a possible inbound contact. He did not say the word hypersonic, and he did not say the word unstoppable, but the weight of the unspoken words hung in the recycled air of the compartment like a physical presence. Below the flight deck, the 5,000 sailors of the aircraft carrier continued their morning routines, unaware that the digital ghost on the screens upstairs was the harbinger of a new and terrible era. The ship was still a titan of the seas, a magnificent monument to industrial power and national will, but in the blue-lit silence of the Combat Information Center, the first cracks were appearing in the foundation of that power. The ghost was no longer a flicker on the screen. It was a certainty, a mechanical predator that had already won the battle of the minds, before the first piece of steel had even been touched. The ocean outside remained a black, indifferent void, while inside the hull, the machine continued to hum, oblivious to the fact that its time as the master of the horizon was coming to a violent and permanent end. 6:21 in the morning. High above the Philippine Sea, at the ragged edge where the atmosphere thins into the vacuum of space, the DF-17 hypersonic glide vehicle was no longer merely a weapon. It had become a physical impossibility made manifest in fire and ionized gas. It moved at a velocity of 5 kilometers per second, a speed so profound that the air itself could not move out of the way fast enough, instead piling up against the nose cone of the vehicle until the temperature reached 3,000 degrees. This heat did not just melt metal, it stripped the electrons from the nitrogen and oxygen molecules in the air, creating a shimmering, white-hot shroud of plasma that completely encased the projectile. This was the plasma veil, a kinetic phenomenon that acted as a perfect cloak against the prying eyes of the United States Navy's most advanced sensors. The Aegis combat system, housed within the steel skin of the USS Abraham Lincoln and her escorting cruiser CG-73, was a masterpiece of 20th century engineering, a trillion-dollar clockwork designed to track and kill anything that flew. But the architects of Aegis had built their cathedral of logic on the assumption that an enemy would follow a predictable path, either a ballistic arc or a low-altitude cruise. They had not accounted for a ghost that could maneuver at 5 times the speed of sound while hidden behind a curtain of superheated gas that absorbed radar pulses like a sponge. To the AN/SPY-6 radar arrays, the DF-17 was not a solid object, but a flickering, incoherent smudge of atmospheric noise, a glitch in the software that the system's algorithms were programmed to filter out and ignore. The technological gap was not a failure of effort, but a failure of imagination, a belief that the horizon would always belong to the side with the most processing power. In the quiet laboratories where these systems were birthed, the scientists had spoken of probability of kill and track illumination as if war were a mathematical proof that could be solved with enough silicon and code. They had forgotten that the sea is a brutal, entropic environment, where the raw physics of mass and velocity eventually overwhelm the elegance of any circuit. The DF-17 was the ultimate expression of that entropy, a jagged piece of steel and carbon fiber that had bypassed 3 decades of electronic evolution by simply moving too fast for the evolution to matter. Below the plasma veil, the sailors of the carrier strike group were living in a world that had already ended, though they did not yet know it. They stood at their stations in the dim, recycled air of the ship, surrounded by screens that told them the sky was clear and the mission was proceeding according to the established plan. There is a deep, unsettling irony in the fact that the more complex a civilization becomes, the more vulnerable it is to a simple, overwhelming force. The Abraham Lincoln was a city of 5,000 souls, a floating monument to American industrial will, Yet she was being hunted by a machine that had no soul and no pilot, guided only by the cold, unblinking logic of a guidance computer that calculated the curvature of the Earth in microseconds. The philosophy of the carrier era had always been one of projection, the idea that the mere presence of these 10-story-high walls of steel could deter any aggressor and maintain the order of the oceans. But as the DF-17 began its terminal descent, shifting its flight path with a series of violent, high-G maneuvers that would have crushed a human pilot, that philosophy was being shredded. The ocean air, salt-heavy and cold, was about to be pierced by a heat that belonged in the heart of a star, a kinetic energy so vast that it did not even require an explosive warhead to achieve its purpose. The sheer weight of the vehicle, moving at 3,000 miles per hour, was enough to punch through 10 decks of hardened steel as if they were made of wet paper. The tragedy of the coming moment lay in the absolute silence of the approach. Because the missile was moving faster than the sound it produced, there would be no warning whistle, no scream of an engine, no roar of a rocket. There would only be the sudden, catastrophic arrival of a force that the human mind is not equipped to process, a transition from peace to annihilation that happens in less time than it takes for a heart to beat once. The geopolitical order of the last 70 years was balanced on the flight deck of that ship, and that balance was now being tilted by a weapon that the defenders could not see, could not track, and could not stop. The gray ocean continued to roll in long, slow swells, indifferent to the fact that the era of the great ships was about to meet its violent and permanent conclusion in the white-hot light of the plasma veil. 6:23 in the morning. The bridge wing of the USS Abraham Lincoln was a narrow, salt-crusted ledge of steel, suspended 70 feet above the churning Pacific, where the wind carried the biting cold of the open sea and the faint, metallic scent of distant rain. For the lookout standing watch, the world was a study in shades of charcoal and lead, a heavy, overcast sky meeting a darker ocean in a horizon that seemed to dissolve into nothingness. He had been trained to spot the wake of a periscope or the silhouette of a low-flying strike fighter, but nothing in his instruction had prepared him for the sight of a star falling toward the Earth in the middle of a gray Tuesday morning. The silence of the moment was profound, a heavy, expectant stillness that felt like the indrawn breath of a world that was about to be irrevocably changed. The DF-17 did not arrive with a roar or a scream, for it was traveling at 5 times the speed of its own sound, outrunning the noise of its passage across the sky. Instead, it announced itself by simply tearing the clouds apart. A jagged, white-hot incision in the overcast ceiling that glowed with the intensity of a magnesium flare. The lookout saw it first as a point of light, no larger than a planet. But within a single second, it had expanded into a terrifying, elongated shape wrapped in a shimmering veil of blue and white fire. There was no time for an alarm, no time for the brain to process the geometry of the collision, only the raw, lizard brain realization that something impossible was descending with the weight of a mountain and the speed of a thought. 10 seconds. That was the window of time between the visual confirmation and the end of the world as the crew of the Abraham Lincoln had always known it. In those 10 seconds, the lookout did not think of tactics or the defense of the nation. He thought of the sheer, terrifying beauty of the light, a brilliance so absolute that it seemed to bleach the color out of the ocean and the sky alike. Below him, on the flight deck, the yellow-shirted handlers and the pilots in their cockpits were just beginning to turn their heads, their faces illuminated by a secondary sun that had appeared directly overhead. It was a moment of collective, frozen realization, a realization that the trillion-dollar fortress beneath their feet was no more than a target, and that the ocean was no longer a shield, but a trap. The tragedy of the 10 seconds lay in the absolute helplessness of the human element when confronted by the kinetic finality of the machine. On the bridge, the commanding officer had just enough time to see the streak of light reflecting in the glass of the windows, a silent witness to the failure of every sensor and every plan his country had spent decades perfecting. There is a specific kind of horror in seeing your own obsolescence written in the sky in letters of fire. a recognition that the era of the great ships was being ended by a projectile that had cost less than a single wing of the aircraft parked on the deck. The ship was a monument to a century of American power, but in the face of the DF-17, it was merely 10 decks of steel waiting to be unmade. The environment of the bridge wing, once a place of professional focus and maritime tradition, was instantly transformed into a space of pure, unadulterated vulnerability. The salt air was suddenly dry and hot, the temperature rising as the friction of the missile's passage began to heat the very atmosphere around the carrier. The sound finally arrived, not as a whistle, but as a physical blow, a thunderclap that cracked the glass and sent a vibration through the hull that felt like the ship was being struck by a giant hammer. It was the sound of the sky breaking, a violent, ripping noise that signaled the arrival of a force that discovered no resistance in the air and would find none in the steel. In the final 3 seconds, the DF-17 adjusted its terminal trajectory, its guidance computer executing a final, minute correction that aligned its kinetic energy with the center of the carrier's flight deck. The plasma veil was shedding now, leaving a trail of sparkling debris in its wake like the tail of a dying comet. As the weapon prepared to deliver its message of entropy to the heart of the strike group, there was no philosophy left in the moment, only the cold, hard mathematics of mass and velocity. The lookout closed his eyes, not out of prayer, but because the light had become too great to bear, a whiteout of the senses that preceded the physical impact of the hammer. This was the end of the silence, the final tick of a clock that had been winding down since the first carrier was commissioned a century before. The geopolitical consequences would fill libraries and occupy the minds of historians for generations. But for the 5,000 souls on the Abraham Lincoln, the world had narrowed down to the space of a single heartbeat. The gray ocean, which had seen the rise and fall of countless empires, waited for the first splash of fire, an indifferent witness to the moment when the iron horizon finally collapsed. The 10 seconds were over, and the era of the machine had arrived in a burst of light that made the morning look like midnight. 6:24 in the morning. The collision between the unstoppable force and the immovable object was no longer a theoretical debate for the strategists in Washington or Beijing. It was a physical reality that began at the molecular level of the carrier's flight deck. The kinetic energy carried by a 10-ton object moving at 5 kilometers per second is a mathematical absolute that transcends the strength of any alloy or the cleverness of any defensive scheme. As the missile descended, it was no longer just a weapon, but a delivery system for a force of nature that had been harvested from the very edge of physics. The USS Abraham Lincoln, a fortress that had projected the will of a superpower for decades, was about to become an anvil for a hammer forged in the fire of hypersonic friction. The DF-17 executed its final terminal maneuver, the guidance computer locking onto the center of the carrier's mass with a cold, digital certainty. The weapon shrieked through the final 1,000 meters of atmosphere, the friction turning the surrounding air into a white-hot tunnel of compressed gas that screamed with a frequency that could shatter bone. There was no explosion at the moment of contact, for the speed of the missile was so great that it did not need chemical assistance to destroy. The nose of the vehicle slammed into the flight deck just aft of the island, the hardened carbon fiber casing punching through 2 inches of reinforced steel as if it were parchment. The kinetic shock wave traveled through the hull faster than the metal could bend, a pulse of energy that shattered the welds of every deck for 5 levels downward. In an instant, the 3,000-degree heat of the plasma shroud followed the entry wound, turning the interior of the hangar deck into a furnace of vaporized hydraulic fluid and atomized aluminum. The carrier shuddered violently, 100,000 tons of steel heaving upward as if struck from below by an earthquake. The flight deck buckled in a massive, jagged wave that sent parked F-35 Bravo fighters tumbling like toys into the sea, their tie-down chains snapping with the sound of rifle shots. Inside the ship, the crew was thrown against bulkheads and overheads by a physical pressure that compressed every chest. In the compartment, a blast wave that turned every loose object into a lethal projectile. Men standing near the impact point did not have time to feel pain. They were simply erased by a thermal pulse that bleached the air white. The great ship groaned, a deep, metallic scream of agony that rose from the very keel, as the structural integrity of the hull began to fail under the weight of its own displacement. A massive column of oily black smoke erupted from the jagged hole in the deck, rising 200 meters into the gray morning sky before the wind could catch it. The white light of the impact faded, replaced by the dull, angry red glow of fires that were already feeding on thousands of gallons of high-octane jet fuel. The radio channels of the strike group, which had been silent for 10 seconds of shock, suddenly exploded into a chaotic storm of overlapping voices, screams for damage control, and the frantic barking of orders that no longer mattered. The sea around the carrier was littered with burning debris and the spreading iridescent sheen of fuel, a graveyard of technology and ambition that was still settling into the water. This was the moment the world changed, the literal and figurative breaking of an era. The impact did not just destroy a ship, it destroyed the belief that a single nation could dictate the terms of existence on the open ocean. The philosophy of carrier-centric warfare, which had defined the global order since the middle of the 20th century, was being consumed by the flames, pouring out of the Abraham Lincoln's side. There is a specific kind of silence that follows a catastrophe of this magnitude, a weight of realization that settles over the survivors, like ash. It is the silence of a man who has lived his whole life in a house he thought was made of stone, only to find out in a single morning that it was actually made of glass. The tragedy of the hammer falling was not just in the loss of life, though that was staggering, but in the realization that the weapon had been so much cheaper than the target. The DF-17 was a product of a decade of focused engineering, a relatively small investment designed to negate a century of naval tradition. As the carrier began to list slowly to port, the internal fires reaching for the ammunition magazines, the geopolitical cost of the strike began to manifest in the minds of the observers. This was not just a battle. It was a demonstration of a new reality where the reach of a superpower is limited by the speed of a single missile. The gray ocean, ever the witness to the vanity of men, surged against the wounded hull of the Lincoln, ready to reclaim the steel that had dared to believe it was invincible. 6:25 in the morning. The USS Abraham Lincoln was no longer a precision instrument of national policy. It was a 10-story furnace encased in 100,000 tons of agonizing steel. The kinetic impact of the DF-17 had punched a jagged, blackened crater through the flight deck, but the true destruction was now being carried out by the 3,000 gallons of jet fuel that had been atomized upon impact. This liquid fire, known to the sailors as a Class Bravo fire, was flowing with the consistency of water and the heat of a blowtorch, cascading down the ruptured elevator shafts and into the berthing compartments, where hundreds of sailors had been sleeping only minutes before. The air inside the ship was no longer breathable, replaced by a thick, oily medium of soot and vaporized hydraulic fluid that coated the lungs like hot lead. From every corner of the ship, damage control parties began to emerge from the chaos, clad in their heavy, fire-resistant gold suits and breathing through the compressed air of their oxygen tanks. These were the red-striped sailors, the men and women whose entire existence was dedicated to the proposition that the ship must live, even if they did not. They moved into the smoke in organized teams, dragging heavy, pressurized fire hoses that buckled and jumped with the force of the salt water being pumped from the sea below. There is a specific kind of courage required to walk toward a roar that sounds like a continuous jet engine into a darkness so absolute that the only light comes from the malevolent orange glow of melting aluminum. They were fighting not just for a vessel, but for the 5,000 souls trapped within a steel box that was rapidly turning into a crematorium. The environment within the hangar deck was a landscape of industrial nightmare, a place where the familiar geometry of the ship had been twisted into unrecognizable shapes by the heat. The acrid stink of burnt rubber and scorched electrical insulation was so pungent it could be tasted through the rubber seals of the gas masks. Overhead, the high-capacity foam sprinkling system had activated, raining down a thick, chemical snow that mixed with the blood and fuel on the deck to create a slick, treacherous slurry. Every time a fire team managed to beat back a wall of flame, a secondary explosion from a ruptured oxygen line, or a heated locker of small arms ammunition would tear through the compartment, forcing them to retreat and start the agonizing process all over again. The tragedy of the inferno lay in the realization that the ship's own systems, designed to protect her, were now being used against her. The ventilation fans, meant to provide fresh air, were instead acting as bellows, drawing the fire deeper into the administrative and engine spaces. The armored hatches, designed to contain flooding, were being warped by the 3,000-degree temperatures until they could no longer be seated, allowing the toxic smoke to migrate into the very heart of the ship's command structure. There was a sense of profound, systemic betrayal, a feeling that the machine had finally reached its limit and was beginning to surrender to the entropy of the strike. In the medical triage areas, located in the relatively stable forward sections of the ship, the reality of the cost was being written. In the screams of the wounded, the doctors and corpsmen worked in a world of red and gray, struggling to treat burns that had stripped the skin from limbs and internal injuries caused by the massive overpressure of the initial blast. There were no ranks. In the triage center, only the shared, hollow-eyed stare of people who had looked into the sun and survived, but were now left to deal with the shadows it had cast. The philosophy of the Navy had always emphasized the resilience of the carrier, the idea that she could take a hit and keep on fighting. But as the casualties mounted into the hundreds, that resilience began to look like a desperate, fading hope. The fire was more than a physical phenomenon. It was a psychological weight that pressed down on every sailor from the bridge to the engine room. It was the sound of the ship dying, a rhythmic, metallic thudding as structural supports collapsed and bulkheads buckled under the thermal stress. The officers on the bridge could feel the heat rising through the deck plates, a reminder that the fire was hunting them, moving upward with a patient, predatory intent. They looked out over the flight deck, seeing the charred remains of the F-35 Bravo fighters, once the most advanced weapons in the world, now reduced to blackened skeletons by a fire that did not care about their stealth coatings or their electronic brains. As the first hour of the struggle drew to a close, the internal temperature of the hull near the impact zone had stabilized at a level that made human intervention nearly impossible. The damage control teams were being rotated out every 15 minutes, their suits steaming, and their faces blistered by the radiant heat. Yet they went back in again and again, driven by a loyalty that transcended logic. This was the war of attrition in its most intimate form, a battle of wills between the cooling power of the ocean and the destructive power of the hypersonic strike. The gray Pacific continued to heave in long, indifferent swells, ready to receive the ship if the fire eventually won, while the USS Abraham Lincoln bled smoke into the morning sky, a Titan struggling to remain upright in a world that had suddenly become too hot to inhabit. 7 in the morning. The cruiser CG-73 and the 3 escorting DDG-51, destroyers of Carrier Strike Group 3, were no longer hunters, but witnesses to a catastrophe that defied every tactical manual they had ever studied. They circled the crippled USS Abraham Lincoln in a wide, desperate arc, their hulls cutting through the heavy swells of the Philippine Sea while their radars continued to sweep the empty, mocking sky for a threat they now knew they could not reliably intercept. The ocean was the color of old pewter under a low, bruised ceiling of clouds, and the air between the ships was thick with the gray, acrid funeral shroud of smoke drifting from the carrier's ruptured flight deck. There is a specific kind of spiritual exhaustion that settles over a fleet when its primary raison d'etre is suddenly and violently rendered vulnerable, a recognition that the shield they had trusted for decades was, in reality, as porous as silk. On the bridge of the cruiser, the commanding officer watched the burning carrier through salt-streaked glass, his hands gripped tight against the railing as he felt the rhythmic thrum of his own engines vibrating through his boots. For 30 years, the Aegis combat system had been marketed as the ultimate guarantor of naval survival, a technological cathedral built on the premise that no spear could ever reach the heart of the American fleet. But that morning, the cathedral had been desecrated by a single, high-speed ghost that had bypassed every sensor and every interceptor, leaving the escorts to perform the hollow ritual of a defensive screen around a dying giant. The philosophy of the Blue Water Navy was being unmade in real time, replaced by a cold, predatory environment where the advantage had shifted decisively to the side, willing to weaponize the raw physics of the hypersonic regime. The destroyers moved with a jagged, nervous energy, their 5-inch guns tracking invisible horizons, while their Mark 41 vertical launch systems stood ready to fire Standard Missile 6 interceptors at a shadow they could not define. Inside the dark, blue-lit interiors of their combat information centers, the atmosphere was one of stifling, high-tension shock as the radar operators struggled to reconcile the clean, digital world of their training with the messy, entropic reality of the engagement. Every flicker of atmospheric clutter or bird sign on the screens now felt like a potential death sentence, a trigger for a frantic, defensive reflex that had been stripped of its confidence. They were sailors who had been taught that information was power, yet they were now drowning in data that provided no clarity and no protection against the next possible strike. The smell of the sea, usually sharp with salt, and the freshness of the wind was now permanently tainted by the chemical bite of the carrier's agony, a mixture of burning aviation spirit and the scorched remains of $1 billion worth of electronics. This scent drifted across the water, entering the ventilation intakes of the escort ships and reminding every man and woman on board that their sanctuary was an illusion. There was no triumph in the maneuvers of the strike group, only a grim, mechanical determination to stay afloat and keep the fires on the Lincoln from spreading to the ammunition magazines. The tactical reality was that the escorts were now the targets of opportunity, and the carrier they were protecting had become a 300-meter anchor that limited their ability to maneuver or retreat. In the higher echelons of command, the realization was beginning to dawn that this was not merely a tactical defeat, but a geopolitical earthquake that would reshape the map of the century. The carrier strike group had been the primary instrument of military stability, a mobile piece of sovereign territory that could be placed anywhere on the globe to enforce the will of the state. But as the naval aircraft carrier listed 5 degrees to port, venting a pillar of black smoke that could be seen from space, that instrument was being revealed as a liability in the age of the hypersonic spear. The war literature of the future would look back on this hour as the moment the superpower realized it could no longer afford the cost of its own defense, a recognition of the limits of steel and the infinite reach of fire. The escorting ships continued their lonely patrol, their prows throwing up white plumes of spray that looked like ghosts against the dark water, while the silence on the radio nets grew more profound. Both sides in this conflict were now staring into a void, where the old rules no longer applied, and the terror of the unknown was beginning to outweigh the strategic objectives that had started the war. The Gray Pacific, which had absorbed the wreckage of thousands of ships over the millennia, waited patiently for the next move in a game where the stakes had become higher than anyone was prepared to pay. 7 in the morning was the hour of the fleet's awakening, a cold and bitter dawn where the protectors realized they were just as vulnerable as the protected, and the ocean was the only thing that remained truly invincible. 8:30 in the morning. The flight deck of the USS Abraham Lincoln was a charnel house of twisted aluminum and blackened debris, where the wind whipped the acrid smoke into a blinding gray veil that smelled of burnt JP-5 fuel and scorched copper. 3 MH-60 Sierra helicopters from the escorting destroyers hovered on the edge of the carrier's thermal wake, their rotors beating against an atmosphere that felt heavy with the weight of 500 casualties. The pilots fought the controls, their hands shaking as they attempted to find a stable patch of non-combusted deck space on a ship that was now listing 7 degrees to port, its massive elevators frozen in their tracks by the structural warping of the initial strike. This was the logistics of despair, a transition from a high-technology war of sensors and satellites to a primitive struggle of muscle, stretchers, and the raw, unshielded reality of human pain. The carrier was now in a dead-stick environment, a term that described the total loss of internal electrical power and the failure of the primary and secondary propulsion systems. In the darkened passageways below the flight deck, the only light came from the dim, flickering beams of handheld flashlights reflecting off the waist-deep water that was flooding the damaged compartments. Without the mechanical advantage of the ship's elevators, the task of moving hundreds of critically burned sailors fell to human chains of survivors, men and women who were themselves coughing up black soot and moving with the slow, jerky motions of the profoundly concussed. There is a specific kind of physical exhaustion that occurs when the machine you live inside ceases to function, turning every simple movement, opening a hatch, climbing a ladder, carrying a friend into an act of Herculean effort that the body was never meant to sustain. In the triage centers established on the tilting flight deck, the medical corpsmen worked with a grim, mechanical efficiency, their uniforms stained a deep, dark red that looked black under the overcast sky. They were performing a brutal calculus, using markers to write letters on the foreheads of the wounded to indicate who could be saved, and who was beyond the reach of their limited supplies of morphine and bandages. This was the human cost of the hypersonic age, a realization that while a missile can be built in a factory in a matter of weeks, a sailor takes 20 years to grow and a single second to unmake. The philosophy of the Navy had always been built on the idea of the ship as a sanctuary, but as the helicopters lifted off with their first loads of the dying, that sanctuary was being revealed as a vulnerable steel shell in an indifferent ocean. The geopolitical consequences of this logistical nightmare were already radiating outward toward the Defense Headquarters facility and the Executive Office. For 70 years, the United States had operated under the assumption that its medical and logistical tail was untouchable, that it could project power and sustain its forces anywhere on the globe without the fear of its primary logistics hubs being decapitated. But as the MH-60 Sierra helicopters ferried the wounded to the cramped, inadequate medical bays of the escorting destroyers, that assumption was being burned away. A single DF-17 missile had not just crippled a carrier, it had overloaded the entire medical and logistical infrastructure of a carrier strike group, proving that the system was only as strong as its most visible and vulnerable node. The air around the ship was filled with the rhythmic thud-thud-thud of the rotors, a sound that became the heartbeat of the morning, a constant reminder of the fragility of the human life that sustained the fleet. The sailors on the deck moved like ghosts through the smoke, their eyes sunken and hollow, their faces blackened by the soot of a fire they could not extinguish. There was no talk of victory or the mission, only the quiet, desperate whispers of those trying to remember the names of the people they were pulling from the wreckage. This was the war stripped of its glory and its technology, reduced to the weight of a stretcher, and the cold, salt spray of the Pacific hitting the faces of those who would never see their homes again. The gray ocean continued its slow, rhythmic surge against the hull, each wave a reminder of the thousands of tons of water that were slowly finding their way into the lower decks of the Lincoln. The logistics of the aftermath were proving to be more taxing than the battle itself, a slow-motion catastrophe where every decision was a choice between two equally terrible outcomes. As the sun climbed higher behind the thick, leaden clouds, the realization settled over the fleet that the USS Abraham Lincoln was no longer a weapon, but a burden, a massive, floating grave that required every ounce of strength from the escorts, just to keep it from slipping beneath the waves. The silence between the rotor beats was the most terrifying sound of all, the silence of a superpower that had finally encountered a force it could not outproduce, outplan, or outheal. 10 in the morning. In the underground bunkers of Indo-Pacific Command in Honolulu and the windowless reinforced corridors of the National Military Command Center in Arlington, the air was cold and recycled, carrying the faint, dry scent of toner and old coffee that seemed to cling to the walls. The digital maps of the Philippine Sea, projected on screens that filled entire walls, showed a flickering red icon where the USS Abraham Lincoln should have been a steady, defiant green, a visual representation of a wound that could not be cauterized by any amount of data or rhetoric. Every officer in the room, from the four-star admirals to the young intelligence analysts, understood with a clarity that felt like a physical weight. in their chests that the geography of the world had just been rewritten by a single piece of hypersonic steel. The carrier was no longer the apex predator of the oceans, but a $13 billion liability that had been stripped of its armor by the raw, unblinking physics of the DF-17. The silence in these command centers was not the silence of peace, but the stunned, heavy stillness of a collective realization that their entire professional lives had been built on a doctrine that was now obsolete. For decades, the military forces had projected power through the Carrier Strike Group, a mobile fortress that could enforce the will of the state across any horizon. Yet that morning had proven that the horizon was now a kill zone. The anti-access and area denial bubble that the foreign military had spent 30 years constructing was no longer a theoretical threat to be debated in academic journals. It was a physical barrier that had just claimed the lives of hundreds of sailors and the integrity of a national symbol. There was a profound, systemic shock in the recognition that the most expensive and complex weapon system in human history could be negated by a projectile that traveled too fast for the human-machine interface to even perceive as a threat. In the higher echelons of the Defense Headquarters facility, the discussion was not about tactics or the repair of a single ship, but about the terrifying void where the security guarantee used to reside. If a carrier could be hit in the open ocean, thousands of miles from the foreign coast, then every base in Japan, every airfield in Guam, and every ship in the 7th Fleet was effectively within the reach of a weapon against which there was no reliable shield. The commanding officers wrestled with the impossible choice of escalation or containment, a decision that carried the weight of a third global conflict and the potential for a nuclear threshold that no one was prepared to cross. They were staring into a future where the Pacific was no longer a protected lake, but a contested wilderness of high-speed sensors and silent, invisible killers that waited for the first sign of a radar pulse to strike. The psychology of the room was one of quiet, hollow-eyed despair, a recognition that the military-industrial complex had spent 50 years perfecting a shield that had been shattered by a single blow from a relatively inexpensive spear. There was a sense of betrayal, a feeling that the technological superiority they had been promised was a mirage, and that they had led 5,000 sailors into a trap of their own making. The admiral in charge of regional command sat at the head of the long, polished conference table, his eyes fixed on the flickering red icon of the carrier, realizing that his fleet was now a collection of targets rather than a projection of force. He understood that to send the other carriers into the regional waters would be an act of madness, yet to withdraw them to distant bases would be an admission that the era of global leadership was over. This was the tragedy of the command decision, a moment where the weight of history and the reality of the present were in direct and violent conflict, leaving the leaders with no good options and only a series of catastrophic risks. The war literature of the coming decades would describe this hour as the moment the superpower realized it was no longer the master of its own destiny. A recognition that the world had moved beyond the age of the great ships and into a fragmented, volatile era of kinetic entropy. The environment of the command centers, once filled with the confident hum of a world-spanning machine, was now a place of whispered doubts and the sound of paper being shuffled by people who were trying to find a plan that no longer existed. Beyond the windows of the Defense Headquarters facility, the sun continued to shine on a world that did not yet know its center of gravity had shifted, while inside, the men and women who held the levers of power were coming to terms with the fact that the levers were no longer connected to anything. The gray Pacific remained an indifferent witness to the struggle, its depths waiting to receive the remains of a strategy that had outlived its usefulness. The decision reached in those cold, blue-lit rooms would determine whether the conflict would expand into a fire that consumed the globe, or if the military forces would begin the long, slow process of retreating behind the horizons it could no longer defend. The hour of the carrier was ending, and the hour of the ghost was beginning, a transition marked by the dead silence of a command that had run out of answers.